Yeah, okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Uh, I, on behalf of the Naga Scholars Association, take this wonderful opportunity to welcome each and every one of you to our international uh, webinar on the theme Living in the Present Nagas in the 21st Century. Now we are in the first the plenary session, which is uh, titled as Civil Society, Social Transformation, and Conflict Resolution. In this particular plenary session, we have a very well-known personality, Professor Neera Chandok, who will be uh, sharing her perspective on civil society and social transformation. Let me give a brief introduction about Professor Neera Chandok, who is one of the speakers in this session. Well, Professor Neera Chandok is a prominent political scientist and an engaged public intellectual who has contributed enormously to the debate on civil society. She has more than 44 years of teaching experience and engaged in many academic discourses. She has been a visiting professor to some of the leading universities in the world and has also received several prestigious awards for her remarkable contributions in the field of teaching and research. She has also published many books and research papers which have been rated very highly by academic communities across India and world. Actually, she doesn't need much introduction. So this is a very brief introduction about uh, Professor Neera Chanda. Well, uh, we have another speaker, Professor Sanjay Hazarika, who will be joining us a bit later. But let me give a little bit brief introduction about Professor Sanjay Hazarika, who is going to be one of the speakers. Well, Professor Sanjay Hazarika is presently the director of CHRI, that is Commonwealth Human Rights Initiatives. And Professor Sanjay Hazarika is a human rights activist recognized nationally and internationally for designing and developing innovative strategies for inclusive health and governance. I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
Yes, it's all
Okay.
right now.
Well, I'm sorry for that. Thank you very much. Well, we are very privileged to have Professor Yoringham, who will be chairing the session for this session. So without wasting any time, I would like to give the time to the chairperson, Professor Yoringham. I request him to take your time. Professor Yoringham.
Okay. I'm audible to you now?
Yes, very much.
Okay. At outset, let me congratulate the NACA Scholars Organization Associations for organizing this very important international webinar on the very important and timely theme, Living the Present, Nagas in the 21st Century. I'm very hopeful that some concrete findings will emerge during the discussion, which will be very good for the future of the Nagas. I also would like to express my thanks to the organizing committee for giving me this opportunity to chair the session. I'm blessed to chair this session where two important eminent professors will be speaking on a very important and timely issue, civil society organization, civil society transformations and social conflict. I'm all the more blessed to chair this session because Professor Neera Tando, who is alumni from my department, is speaking on a very important topic. Welcome, Professor. I'm very happy to be with you this morning, this session. Okay. Civil society organizations like a safety valve for the ordinary citizens for protection from the operations of ruthless and authoritarian rulers. In my layman's knowledge, civil society organization is a collection or coming together of ordinary citizens on a common interest to protect civil liberties and rights from the operations of the ruthless rulers and to continue to maintain the individual freedom and live with dignity and respect. Besides, civil society also play a very crucial role in cementing relationship among the different communities, ethnic groups and tribals, and maintain peace and harmony in society. I believe this session will be illuminating to each one of us, helping us to get deeper insight on the role of civil society and enlighten us as we listen to the deliberation from the expert professor. Professor will take about 40 to 45 minutes. I request Professor to take 40 to 45 minutes. And that will be followed by question and answer and interaction, which will be about 10 to 15 minutes. I think by that time, Professor Sanjay will be joining with us. And the rest of the time, I'll give to Professor Sanjay. Now, may I request Professor to take your time? Please take time.
Thank you very much for inviting me to deliver this talk at the first working session. The second time I have interacted with the Naga Scholars Association, and I think they're doing a memorable job in bringing to us various perspectives and in bringing people together to debate and dialogue on crucial issues. Now, what I want to do today is to really divide the following presentation into 4 sections. In the first section, I want to relate civil society to democracy and show that civil society is an integral part of the democratic imagination. In the second part, I want to talk about the historical moment which catapulted civil society to the center stage of the political discourse. In the third section, I will deal briefly with India and its experience of civil society. And in the fourth, I want to offer some critical comments on the whole concept of civil society. Now, I start by suggesting that no concept or the set of practices that that concept encapsulates or conceptualizes can never be independent of other concepts or other sets of practices. We should not be looking at concepts as isolated from each other, because that would be a mistake. We will fail to understand how different areas of life interact with each other and how they affect each other. And I make this argument in full consciousness that when civil society first emerged as a very dominant concept in political debates in the 1980s and 1989, 1990s, it was seen as an alternative set, as a concept that was alternative to the power-driven market, the power-driven state and the profit-driven market. I would suggest that we see and locate civil society in democracy, and as realizing the basic precepts of democratic life. And what are these precepts? We live in very, very difficult times, in political times, where our rulers have reduced democracy only to elections and the processes whereby a new elite comes to power and displaces the old elite. Now, there is something to be said for this, that democracy enables the peaceful transfer of power. But if you reduce democracy only to elections, and we have in India the experience of having an election every 6 months, so there is heightened public political discourse, polarization, abuses, a certain degree of violence also, then we have to remember that democracy is much more than elections or giving a particular ruling class the power to do with its people as it wills. First of all, civil society has to do with the concept of popular sovereignty. This concept of popular sovereignty, as introduced in the Indian Constitution, is we, the people of India, give to ourselves the Constitution based upon freedom, justice, and fraternity. Now, in a way, it serves to remind the ruling elites, as well as remind ourselves, that the holder of popular sovereignty is not the state. It is the Constitution, and the Constitution has been adopted by the people. Now, the people is, of course, not a demographic concept, it is a political concept. It refers to those citizens who are in a position to vote and bring a ruling class to power, and also with the capacity to dismiss this ruling class and get another set of people to govern themselves. So in the end, the people are sovereign. In the end, the people are exercise popular sovereignty, and this is how democracy differs from other forms of government. More importantly, the concept of civil society tells us that ordinary people like you and me have the political competence to intervene in those processes by which policy decisions are taken. They have the political competence to intervene in political processes, the processes of power, the processes of controlling power, the processes of holding power to account. We cannot elect a government and leave the country to that government for the next 5 years. There has to be constant evaluation, constant monitoring, constant participation. And one of the most significant rights that have been thrown up by democracy, the right to politically participate in the affairs of that country. In fact, it is a reminder that politics is too important to be left to politicians. It has to be shared, because democratic government is based upon popular opinion and is responsive to that popular opinion. The third set of institutions, which are the pillar of democracy and which safeguards civil society, is the right to freedom of expression and the right to life and liberty. More importantly, it gives you the right to associations, to form associations. Now, in a way, this concept of freedom of expression realizes what it means to be human. To be human means that you have the capacity to think and to put forward well-considered notions in the public domain. Now, civil society provides us with a public domain on which we put forth our opinion, our views, our ideologies, our perspectives, our interests. But more importantly, an individual cannot arrive at considered public opinion, an individual cannot arrive at considered views, or even a notion of what is important, our interest, unless it is the outcome of debate, unless we listen to each other, unless we learn from each other, and in that matter, we arrive at a certain amount and give or take. Now, it is not important that the process of debate should lead to an outcome. There is no idea of the Thomas Hobbes's notion of a social contract, that you will create a social contract and create a state. The process of dialogue, the process of debate is never ending, because truth cannot be achieved. It is a search. Civil society is not targeted towards creating one opinion, one ideology, one set of interests. It is a process of arriving at certain considered reflective opinions through the process of debate and dialogue. In divided societies, it is more important that we start talking to each other instead of picking up the gun. The process of talking together would mean when I talk to you, you talk to me, we recognize each other as humans, as people who have a certain capacity to put forth intelligent viewpoints, knowing and be ready to accept that these viewpoints are flawed and we need to change our own viewpoints. So through debate and dialogue, conflict societies can perhaps enter into some degree of understanding that you are not a stranger because you belong to a different tribe or a different caste or a different religious community. You and I are the same. And we establish our sameness, we establish our interconnectivity through processes of dialogue. And the venue for this process of dialogue is a space we call civil society. Civil society has one more aspect in political theory, which I want to point out to you, is that it does not allow violence. In fact, as we will see, that when civil society emerges as a definitive component of the onrush of public opinion in Eastern Europe and Central Europe, it replaced the concept of revolution. There is no concept of revolution. They're all as using violence. There's only transformation through the process of collectively reflecting upon issues that concern all of us, because every policy by the state, enacted by the state, affects you and me. It affects us. And because it affects us, we have to be very careful to monitor the state and, more importantly, monitor civil society. Now, in this process, you do not allow violence. The only weapons of civil society are the weapon of argumentation, are the weapon of debate, of dialogue, and more importantly, respecting each other by listening to each other. The next point I wish to emphasize is that civil society has one specific job, and that is to monitor the exercise of power by the state. We have handed over power to the holders of immense, awesome political power, who are the officials of the state. We cannot leave it to them to exercise this power as they will. We have to constantly monitor civil society. And in this sense, civil society, validates that famous aphorism which was pronounced by a judge of the High Court: eternal vigilance is the price you pay for freedom. It's very, very important that we do not trust our rulers. We regard power, because power, we all know, corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. We keep a check on them through a free media, through debate, through dialogue, through our power of expression, through the weapons that are available to civil society. That may be occupation of public spaces, it may be demonstrations, it may be processions, it may be going on a fast, it may be civil boycott, civil disobedience, all the repertoire of weapons that are available to civil society as a part of civil disobedience, knowing even if you break the law, you must be ready to accept punishment. You're challenging a law, but you're doing so peacefully, and you are ready to face the consequences, and there will be consequences. And we have a dramatic and a very magnificent expression of this uprise against a very discriminatory law, the Citizenship Amendment Act, which was passed by the Parliament early December 2019. And on the 15th of December, when the students of Jamia Millia took out a procession to protest against very discriminatory legislation, and which might not have targeted them, but would have targeted their fellow citizens, you had the police, of course, behaving in a very irresponsible fashion. People were hurt. And immediately, spontaneously, universities across the country erupted in anger, in protest. It was completely peaceful. Now, if you look at the anti-CAA agitation from 15th December onwards till the pandemic broke out, you see 3 or 4 characteristics which are symptomatic of civil society, which are definitive of civil society. First of all, each of these protest movements, these meetings, these demonstrations, this occupation of public service, of public spaces, was completely peaceful. Secondly, what were the weapons? What were they saying? We are citizens of India. The Constitution is our protection. So they marched, they sang, on the one hand, Constitution, and in the other hand, the flag of India, and against the background of all the famous martyrs of the freedom struggle who had given to us freedom through civil disobedience, even Bhagat Singh. Though he adopted violence, he gave it up at a later stage. Gandhi, Ambedkar. Now, in a way, it was saying, we are the citizens of India. You have no business asking us for papers to establish your citizenship. In a way, they were protesting against the idea of what is called in Europe paper citizenship, that your citizenship depends upon you holding the necessary documents. I mean, how many of us have birth certificates? We might have mislaid them at some point or the other. How many of us, and the poor certainly cannot, and in the Northeast particularly, how is it that you establish your citizenship? You establish your citizenship through symbolic means, through saying, we are citizens, this is our constitution, this is our protection, this is our weapon against arbitrary legislation. In a way, what we saw was the enactment of civil society in a performative vein, what we call performative citizenship. Finally, I think these demonstrations, these spontaneous demonstrations, there were no political parties involved. Nobody mobilized these young people. In fact, the story goes, the young people were telling me that when Priyanka Gandhi went to India Gate, the young people told her, why are you here? You've come here with your security guards and you're showing you're showing the power of, you're showing your power. We don't want you. We are citizens of India. We are reclaiming, they're not asking for a new right. They were reclaiming the right of citizenship by the fact of being born in this country. And more importantly, they were showing, each one of these demonstrators, that we feel for our fellow citizens who might be affected not only by the CAA, but also by the National Register of Citizens and whatever discriminatory legislation. So they were articulating a right which so far has gone unarticulated, the obligation of solidarity towards your fellow citizens. We are Indian. By that reason, we inhabit a community of faith. We have a common faith. Today, your fellow citizens are targeted. Tomorrow, I will be targeted. You will be targeted. We have to stand up and say we protest against discriminatory legislation. And we had the finest example of civil society against the state. Finally, well, what is civil society? Now, civil society is a concept that comes up with modernity and the separation of various spheres of action into very discrete domains. You have the state, which is power-driven. You have the market, which is driven by profit. We have the household, which is driven by emotions. In between lies the sphere of associational life, where people come together for two purposes, possibly more. One is for social associationalism. No individual is an island. And the anomie, the alienation, the loneliness of modernity, when you leave your homes, your villages, your traditional communities, and come into urban spaces to work, to study, suddenly you meet strangers. And how do you relate to strangers? How do you relate to people who are not like us? In your traditional homes, you know how to relate to strangers. But in an urban sphere, which is the sphere of modernity, which is the sphere of alienation, you have to relate to people. You're working with people, you're studying with people, you're interacting with people, you're going to restaurants with people who may well be unknown, and they are knowable in more traditional spaces. You have to invent rules of coming together, of living together in peace. And these roles are invented by associational life. So civil society is the realm of associations. They may be football clubs, and I'm using football because today we heard of the death of Maradona, the great football player. These may be film fan clubs. You look at the number of fans that South Indian actors have, from Rajnikant to Kamal Hassan. These may be literary societies, these may be debating societies, these may be, environmental organizations, these may be bird watching societies, they may be social audit organizations that keep a watch on the government. There may be civil liberties movement, there'll be anti-gender movement, there will be the anti-caste movement, there will be the movement against communalism. Various projects take place in civil society, but not all of these projects interact with each other or gel into each other. You will have a gender struggle movement, women asking for gender rights. You might also have a movement that upholds patriarchy. And this, now that we are so reliant upon the social media for a communication, we find that a number of patriarchal groups completely dominate the social media. That would mean that civil society is not of itself a harmonious sphere. It is a plural sphere. It is often divided. And the task of keeping a watch on which organization is democratic and which is not a democratic falls upon the democratic organizational framework. So if you have a civil liberties movement, then that civil liberties movement has to identify not only violation of your basic right, the right to life, the right to liberty, the right to freedom of expression, the right to association against the state, they will also protect fellow citizens from violation of these rights by other groups in society, communal groups, caste groups, fascist groups, chauvinistic groups, groups that have picked up weapons. So civil society organizations that hold the claim to democracy have to really be Janus-faced. They have to be two-faced. One face toward the state, the other face toward its own domain, towards the seeds of democracy. And what can you do? You see, every organization that may be completely fascist and communal is registered as an NGO. You see, whether it may be a communal organization of a political party, or it may be just a fascist organization, and there are many of them going around. In the United States, you have alt-right, which is a number of patriarchal, white, male-dominated organizations, which were the backbone of Donald Trump. Now, these dominate the social media. They dominate even civil society. You will have chambers of commerce there, which represent capital interest. You will also have workers' organizations. You will have people, anti-caste movement. You will also have upper caste movements. And in a way, civil society cannot be seen but in two ways. A, as a project of projects, where multiple projects take place, and B, as a space that has to clearly keep watch on the maintenance of democracy and its violation not only by the state, but also by other civil society organizations. And I say this because a number of theorists have started arguing that whereas the state is driven by power and the market is driven by profit, civil society is driven by civility. And we have come to realize that a number of organizations in civil society are also driven by uncivility. And I don't want to name them, but there are any number of organizations. If you look at university campuses to see how these organizations work, always protesting against what they see as a violation of Indian culture, whether it is a series on Netflix, or whether it is Valentine's Day, or whether it is women smoking or women wearing dresses. Now, the basic right of an individual, of a citizen in a democracy, to pursue her own projects in a certain degree of independence is compromised when there are groups telling you what to wear, what not to wear, who to marry, who not to marry, how to bring up your children, what kind of ideology. I mean, these groups have to be fought. So as the German philosopher Hegel said in 1820, civil society is a theater of history, because it is here that conflicts are overcome through the mechanism of dialogue and debates. Having said that, let me now come to the second part of my presentation, and that is, when and how did civil society come to occupy such an important part of our political discourse? For that, we have to go back to the 1980s and what came to be known as the crisis of representation across the world, not only in India. But let me take India and East Europe as two representatives. In India, after independence, that is in 1947, the Indian National Congress took over power. Now, the virtue of the Congress was A, that it was associated with the leadership of the freedom struggle, and therefore it was legitimate in the eyes of that generation, the generation of the 50s and the 60s. The second aspect of the Congress was that it was actually an organization of organizations. It was a coalition of various interest groups. In fact, historians have argued that the Congress Party was composed of various big men, peasant leaders, trade union leaders, industrialists, caste leaders, religious leaders. Almost all of them were male in that aspect. And in a way, all decisions of the Congress were undertaken after a process of consultation and negotiation between these different factions. The Congress was a coalition. Rajni Kothari, the famous sociologist, wrote a book in which he called on the Congress system, in which he said the virtue of the Congress is that the opposition is within the Congress. You don't even need an opposition. By 1967, the Congress had changed its form. For two reasons. One, it had lost state elections. Till 1967, between 1952 and 1967, Congress was winning central elections as well as state elections. In 1967, state elections, the Congress Party lost in many states because new regional elites came up. The second reason was the ascendance of Mrs. Indira Gandhi as the Prime Minister of the country. Now, she was appointed by these big bosses who controlled Congress as somebody who would listen to them. And she showed that she had a personality of her own. She had a charisma of her own. And she did that by changing the structure of the Congress Party from a coalition into a unitary structure controlled by only her. So regional bosses were thrown out. A prominent example is that of Kamraj, who led South India, or other regional bosses. And there was a purge of the Congress in 69, and she comes up as a dominating figure who subordinates everybody to her own will, and she appeals to the country. So instead of a federal system where people respond to regional issues, people started responding to Mrs. Gandhi. She was the first populist that we have seen in history. There was Mrs. Gandhi in India and Bhutto in Pakistan. People responded to her because she had the knack of touching the nerve. In 1971, she wins the elections against Bangladesh, her government does. And more importantly, she appeals to the people during the elections of 71 on the plank of Garibi Hatao, remove poverty. And that was the time when India was having a food crisis, a crisis of employment, a crisis of education, a crisis of just not giving to its people the basic conditions within which they could live a life of dignity. Around the 1960s, along with the ascendance of Indira Gandhi and her changing the shape of the Congress Party, its ability to reconcile different points of view within its own framework, we have two very interesting consequences. One is the Congress Party becomes a court. It becomes a darbar. It only listens to the leader. So the members of the Congress Party who are elected by the people of India to positions of power are now subordinated to the Congress leader rather than being responsive to the people who had elected them. You know, the extent of poverty in India is so alarming. And if the representatives had really done something about poverty, and I'm just looking for some figures that have come out recently. Just give me a second. This is in January 2020, the human rights group Oxfam released a study in Davos ahead of the 50th annual meeting of the World Economic Forum. The study reports, and you look at the statistics, the richest 1% of the Indian population owns more than 4 times the wealth held by 953 million people who make up the bottom 70% of the population. The gap between the rich and the poor, Amitabh Beher, who is the CEO of Oxfam, said cannot be narrowed unless the government does something, but the government has obviously done nothing. And people were languishing in poverty, languishing in starvation. But in a way, the charisma of Indira Gandhi was also very strong. So people, the Congress party had failed to represent the interests of its constituency. This is what we call the crisis of representation, when your representatives fail to represent your interests. If they had represented interests, we would not have this kind of poverty till January 2020, and the situation has become worse with the pandemic. The second interesting development is that the concentration in the hand of power in the hands of Mrs. Gandhi and a tendency to authoritarianism is challenged. 1969, J.P. Narayan, the socialist leader, leads massive demonstrations in Bihar and in Gujarat against what they see as corruption, concentration of power, non-representation. And J.P. Narayan says political parties have failed to perform what the duty for which they have been voted into power. We want a partyless democracy. The consequences, anybody who's familiar with recent Indian history are well known. Mrs. Gandhi imposes the emergency, suspends civil liberties. Now, what you have to do when you suspend civil liberties is very simple. And I'm saying this because the Supreme Court has been talking about it. Article 32, which entitles you, of the Fundamental Rights chapter of the Indian Constitution, entitles you to go to the court if any of your fundamental rights given from Article 14, 13 to 31 have been violated. You suspend that, that means you can't go to court if your civil liberties are being violated. Civil liberties were violated. There was censorship imposed upon the media. And I still remember the Indian Express carrying just blank pages because everything they had written was censored. So just carried a blank page. One day the newspaper comes with just a blank page, white page, that's it. That was their own way, Kuldeep Nair, of showing protest against the censorship. Now in 77 January, Mrs. Gandhi lifts the emergency and calls for elections. And immediately after that, you have the formation of what later came to be known as civil society. The first organization that comes up in civil society is civil liberties. Now, civil liberties by much of the left have been seen as bourgeois rights. It's a right of property, right of life, right of liberty. It is the right to freedom of expression. And the left had been arguing that if you have civil liberties, but you don't have social rights, then what is the point? If people don't have enough to eat, a hungry person cannot be a free person. But then it was realized after the emergency that if you suspend civil liberties of people, you're depriving them of an essential nature of their being human beings. Because human beings are dialogical animals. We express ourselves through language. You put up, curtail my power to express myself. You take away from me what is human about me, the power to reflect, the power to think, the power to express, the power to persuade other people, the power to be persuaded by other people. The second movement that comes up in a very strong form is the anti-patriarchy movement, the gender struggles. The third movement that comes up in civil society is the environmental, and these are not sequential, these are movements that come up in the course of the 70s and the 80s. And the most fantastic, the most magnificent of the environment movement is the Narmada Bachao Andolan, or the movement to stem the construction of the dam in the Narmada Valley. Now, here's a very interesting instance of participation, of people's right to participate in policy. There were any number of architects, any number of engineers, any number of scientists who joined the Narmada Bachao Andolan led by Medha Patkar to say, should India be building big dams? Because dams, nuclear projects, big factories displace tribals. Now, when you displace Adivasis, you deprive them of their right to life because they are at home in the forest among the water, you know, being in control of their own culture. There are hundreds and thousands of Bhils and Bhilalas who were removed from the mountain that surround the Narmada Valley and located in puritanical Gujarat. For example, I did a project there, one of the few empirical projects I've done, talking to women. And they said, we miss the right, we miss our habits of smoking or drinking, because you're in Gujarat, which doesn't allow alcohol. We also miss our right of changing husbands, because they have matriarchal societies. Much of the Bhil and the Bilala tribes. In a way, you deprive people of their entire way of life when you're building. So a number of alternative development planks came up, and you had a number of other civil society organizations which were talking about alternative education or talking about alternative ways of teaching science, which would make science intelligible to ordinary people. You have to understand that the most important issues in India have come up in civil society. They've not been initiated by the political party system. No political representative. The entire fight against Article 377, which makes homosexuality an offense, was fought by civil society organizations, and they won. Gender struggles are fought in civil society, environment struggles, anti-caste struggles, anti-class struggles. And by the late 80s, this social movements and struggles, associational life in this space outside the state. I mean, Rajni Kothari said, I failed in understanding the Indian state. The real creativity is in these social movements. They give you the culture of India. Everybody was looking towards Kishore Bharati in Madhya Pradesh or Alternative Science Forum in Bhopal, looking at alternative ways of living your life and not only the capitalist structure which governs you. That was the seeds of creativity, not the state, which had completely become moribund. Political parties had become moribund. They had become, caught in bureaucracy. And the whole notion of civil society. And very quickly, why does civil society come onto the horizon? Civil society came into political discourse as a result of the struggles of East Europeans and Central Europeans. East Germany, Yugoslavia, what used to be Yugoslavia, what used to be Czechoslovakia, Poland, Albania, the East European states who were under the leadership of the Soviet Union. They were the socialist bloc or the Second World. Now, they were denied basic civil liberties. They were not allowed freedom of expression. They were subjected to surveillance. They could not associate. And they realized that the two roads which have been classically offered to people, as a way out of servitude and surveillance, the revolution from above and revolution from below. Revolution from above being the case of Germany and Japan in the late 19th century, where an educated elite transformed society. And revolutions from below, Soviet Union, the Russian Revolution 1917, and the Chinese Revolution 1949, the nationalist revolutions against colonialism, that these were denied to them. Because the Soviet Union had made it very clear that we will interfere every time there is a challenge to your state. So people in East Europe turned their backs upon government and started associating in a space they called civil society. Now, this notion of civil society is taken from the political theorist de Tocqueville, Alexis de Tocqueville, who said the science of association is the mother of all sciences. So East Europeans got together in soup clubs, in film fan clubs, in debating societies, in literary societies, discussion, debate, dialogue. What they wanted to do was connect. And one thing is very important, which becomes an unwritten rule for civil society organizations do not compete for political power. They're outside political powers. Now, in a way, the social becomes the political in 1989, and you have massive crowds assembled outside the government offices, the institutions of state power, the symbolic representations of the sovereign state saying, enough, we want freedom. And so many states fell, powerful states collapsed like a house of cards. It showed you what the Italian theorist Antonio Gramsci had said about civil society and about revolution. Revolutions happen when the state is openly oppressive. Because one thing people want is freedom. It's almost a physical, reflexive act. And we have seen this in the Arab Spring. We have seen this in the anti-monarchy demonstrations in Nepal. We have seen this in Pakistan when the lawyers got together and just thousands of lawyers agitating against a military regime led by President Musharraf, which paved the way for a democracy. In Nepal, incidentally, the monarchy was abolished and you had a democratic government. We have seen this in country after country where there are authoritarian states. Gramsci said, revolutions have not happened in Western Europe. Why? Because they have civil society. When you can vent your anger against the state through your open columns in a newspaper, they act as a proverbial safety valve of a pressure cooker. The pressure is let out, people don't revolt. Because civil society was seen as the key to democracy in East Europe, and incidentally in Latin America, particularly in Brazil, people were mobilizing against military regimes, and they succeeded. Policymakers globally started thinking of civil society as the key to democracy. And in a way, international funders set up NGOs and said, go to the third world and build civil societies. So I'm afraid one net outcome of this was the NGOization of civil society. Civil society in political theory is a sphere, is an attitude of civility, where you do not adopt violence, but you adopt the weapons of debate and dialogue, the metaphorical weapons, to connect with other people. When you have NGOization, we also see a bureaucratization of political life. So I'll come to the final point, part of what is the problem with civil society? We should encourage civil society because that might bring an end to violence. In the socialist worlds, the advent of civil society heralded the end of revolution. There was to be no revolution because revolutions eat up their own children. You want a civil society where people can associate and make demands upon the state. That is a better safety valve, and that is a protection of democracy, the right to participation, more than anything else, more than laws or formal institutions of the state. Of course, you must also have an independent judiciary. You must also have the rule of law. You must also have political parties willing to work with civil society organizations. But there are certain things civil society cannot do. During the United Progressive Alliance 1, led by the Congress Party, 2004-2009, civil society, heads of civil society organizations were invited by Mrs. Sonia Gandhi, the president of the Congress Party, to associate with her in the National Advisory Council, and 4 or 5 very important social laws came out. The right to food, the right to work, the right to information, and the right to primary education. Now, these were very often the outcome of the judiciary. The judiciary had been partnering Mrs. Indira Gandhi in the emergency, and they wanted to rehabilitate themselves, the judges of the Supreme Court. So the right to food, the right to work all came up. But the same court could encourage the right to food, the right to education, the right to jobs, but they went against the appeal of the Narmada Bachao Andolan not to allow the raising of the height of the dam, because the higher a dam becomes, the more people are displaced. That they ruled against. So in a way, civil society can only work within the system. You wonder then what has happened to our notion of redistributive justice, of egalitarianism, of equality, of people getting equal chances to access the opportunities offered by that society. So it worked within the limits of the state. But it does something very important. It brings people together, and a social movement can also transform itself into a political movement, as we see in the case of East Europe. Finally, what we see in civil society recently, and this is probably a product of the NGOization, where you have NGOs, you have bureaucracies, you also have very big salaries. So no longer civil society neighborhood associations or football clubs or parent-teacher associations or debating societies. Civil society has become bureaucratic, and very often when you see the branches of a major international organization in the West setting up roots in India, you say, whose agenda are they following? Who are they responsible to? So no longer do we have the kind of mobilization that peasant struggles, our workers' movements carried out during much of our freedom struggle, and even after independence. Civil society it talks about freedom. It really doesn't talk about redistributive justice, or that resources should be redistributed or distributed equally among people. Equally, not in the sense of everybody should have the same, but everybody should have a rough chance of accessing. Now, civil society organizations are very media savvy. They lobby with parliamentarians, they lobby with the media, they make their platforms explicit through access to the media. They have mass meetings, but where is the mobilization telling Indian people these are your rights? We'll still have to look at the anti-CAA movements as emblematic of civil society more than NGOization. So whereas civil society is a very important part of democracy, please do not glamorize anything in political life to an extent where you stop to criticize it. Because politics cannot be, and you're scholars, most of you, politics cannot be shown defense, judge, and jury. Politics has to be reflected upon and evaluated by observers who bring a historical perspective to bear upon current issues. Scholars are not, media. You're not supposed to churn out fancy, what do they call them? Cyber bites, sound bites. You're supposed to bring upon the present and upon your contemporary moment processes from history. So I'd like you to reflect on whether we can really think of the current move to ban marriages between different religious communities without thinking of a similar initiative launched by the Nazis in Germany. We did not allow marriages between the Aryan Germans and the Jewish people. Can we avoid thinking about that when you see this rush by BJP-led state to ban what they call love jihad? I've never understood what it means, but presumably they don't think our young people are mature enough to marry whom they want to. I stop here, and we carry on as the chairperson wants.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor. It was so much illuminating by listening to your presentation. Professor has presented very precisely on the 4 sub-point: democracy and civil society, historical movement, historical development, and Indian experience, and the critics, how civil society turned into NGOs and lost its meaning and influence. That's very important. I think I won't take much time to say because the time is running out now. In the meantime, let me just welcome to Professor Sanjay Hazare. Sanjay Hazare has come just now. Welcome, Professor.
Thank you. I'm sorry I'm late, but in these times of Zoom and the pandemic, one is sort of zooming from one place to the other.
I know, Professor, but let me just take some time for question answer for Professor Neera's presentation. Maybe 5 minutes, since the time is very limited.
Let's do it together after Sanjoy makes his presentation. Okay. I don't want to cut into his time. Shall we do it together?
No problem.
I think, we can do together.
Okay, that's a good idea. Okay. So our president has already introduced Professor Sanjoy, so I need not repeat again. I will just straight away give the time to Professor. So take your time, Professor.
Yeah, just looking for some particular note. One second. I don't have a presentation because when I come to a conversation like this and Professor Chandok is there, I'm really come to learn, and I'm really sorry that I missed, I think, a substantive part of your remarks, Professor. And what I wanted to just share with you was just a few experiences from my travels and my conversation with many Naga friends, both on this side of the border and that side of the border. And one of the issues which I think is of concern to civil society is the role, I think Professor Chanuk referred to this, is the role and impact that civil society has on the current situation, whether it is effective enough, whether it is substantive enough, and whether it goes far enough. Now, the fact of the matter is, even the government of India, in many places, it is not engaging with civil society, it's keeping it at a distance or, taking action against them. But in Nagaland, it is engaging with the civil society because it has no choice but to engage with civil society, because civil society is not just well informed, it is extremely influential. Whether it is the groups which met the Assam minister recently, or the groups which interact with the interlocutor. I don't know who's the interlocutor now. There seem to be two. One is the governor and the other is the Mr. Sharma in Assam, the health and finance minister, who's a very competent person on many of these issues. But I think that in all of this, what I see, and this is an issue which has been raised before, time and again over the years, is the need for gender representation. This is a sensitive issue, and it is something that matters. And I'm very glad that at the last discussions, the NMA, of course, was present and took part. But I think gender representation from both sides is important to influence both the context as well as the framework of whatever settlement or procedural movement forward, shall we say, takes place. And that needs to be truly representative. So if you take a look at the last 50 years, just through the lens of gender, at the official level, only one person, only one woman, shall we say, has actually negotiated on either side at the official table, and that's Indira Gandhi, official, as prime minister. And that was a pretty long time ago. So, and I think that it's very important that it is not just the CSOs, the civil society groups which are involved in these conversations, but they are brought into the larger conversation of an actual dialogue. You can have track 2 and track 3 up to a point, but somehow that needs to go to track 1 in order to for this to make a real difference. Because as we all know, whether it's Nagaland or any other part of the region or in neighboring countries like Myanmar and others, it is the vulnerable groups and women and children who are most affected by this tragedy and the confrontation. There are two other areas I want to look at. One is something that the Shukla Commission report spoke about the Northeast when it was presented, and that was quite some time ago. It talked about 4 deficits. One was an infrastructure deficit. And anybody who's traveled in Dimapur, on the streets of Dimapur, or tried to drive from Dimapur to Kohima, or in any other state for that, or even from Kohima to down to Imphal, you will understand what an infrastructure deficit is. Because I remember many years ago when Atal Bihari Vajpayee was going to Kohima to give those two amazing lectures, which I actually helped to draft. One was at the town hall and the other was in the Kohima, the field. One was at the university, I think, and the other was in the town hall. So somebody came to me and said that, look, we understand the weather has packed up, so the Prime Minister may not be able to go by helicopter to Kohima. So how can he go? I said, there's only one way to go. You go by road, national highway. So he said, how good is the road? I said, it is the best road in Nagaland. So when Vajpayee got off at Kohima, the first thing he said was, if this is the best road in Nagaland, I wonder what the worst road is. So, and that was his style, you know, he could immediately engage with people. He believed in dialogue, he believed in conversation, he believed in trying to understand what the other person was going through. And then he announced the 40 crore grant to the government to improve that condition. Now, the condition hasn't improved very much, except in bits and pieces. No, so infrastructure deficit, a communications deficit. How do you get your story across, your ideas across to Delhi or Delhi to it? A governance deficit. And the last thing it said was a trust deficit. And I think the trust deficit is really the greatest of all our crises. The others are technical. Whether over a period of time, sooner or later, infrastructure will be built, is being built, it's a work in progress. Governance may improve, may not improve, to some degrees it's improved. Your communications is much better, even at the time of the pandemic, with net, like we are communicating to each other on Zoom. These things are happening that build a better understanding. But trust, the trust deficit is critical to overcome and to build those bridges that close that deficit. I would add one other point, which is an integrity deficit. If you don't have an integrity, if there is no integrity in approaching an issue, in the way of governing, in the way you address issues of deep concern to everybody, if there is no financial accountability, that to me is also a very critical problem. I don't know, many of you may have read this recent book by, it's not my book, this book, Numbers in India's Periphery, The Political Economy of Government Statistics. It's by Ankush Agarwal and Vikas Kumar. Vikas is at he may be on this call, I don't know. Vikas teaches at the Aziz Pramje University in Bangalore, and Ankush is at the IIT in Delhi. Now, in this, they actually pick up on an interview I had done some years ago with Mr. Rio, who was then Chief Minister and is still Chief Minister of Nagaland, in which we talked about data. Because I was just doing this huge exercise survey across the Northeast, all the states with 120 enumerators and 20 civil society partners on a very simple thing. What is the vision that people want? The people's vision for themselves. It's 2020, it was a 2020 vision, so it was some time back. Much of that hasn't happened. But what was really interesting was that I got a call late at night, or one of my assistants got a call late at night from Nagaland, saying that there is a problem. Well, in those years, 2004, 2005, if you get a call late at night from Nagaland saying there's a problem, or from Manipur, you wonder what the problem is. So the question was very simple. I asked my assistant, what is it? He said, sir, they're asking a question. I said, what's the question? The question is, there was a sample size of all the villages to be done for the survey, socioeconomic survey for this vision. And it was that 10% of the village would be surveyed, and there would be a focus group discussion and so on. You know, the usual approach of methodology of scholars and academics to fieldwork. So he says, well, we are going to villages which say they have, so how, he says, the question was, how do you do 10% of 19? I said, what do you mean? He says, on the census figures, it's 190 houses. When you go to the villages, 19 houses. So I added a zero. I asked the chief minister this question. I said, you're having a problem with data. He said, yes, we have 5 lakh people who don't exist in Nagaland. The population is shown as 19 lakhs, which is like a part of maybe Karol Bagh or Saket or whatever. But the actual figure is 14 lakhs. And people added numbers because they thought there would be a redrawing of their constituencies and the districts. And that's why you got those huge numbers that surge in population in Nagaland in the 1990s in the various censuses. And now you have a situation where the population has shrunk. The actual population, the only state where the population has shrunk to this enormous proportion. So I say that data is also a deficit. I'm not talking about Nagaland per se. It is a deficit across the region. And one needs to be very, very cognizant of that. I'm going to close with one story because that always moves me when I talk of my travels in Nagaland too. Actually, when I first traveled and I went to Konama, I was driving on a very bad road at that time. Even, you know, I came back completely covered in red earth. And I passed these graves, memorials. And I asked my the friend who was taking me to Konama, his village, or rather his wife's village, because she was from the leading clan there. And I said, who are these memorials to? She said, they are for the national workers. And I said that, you know, there is engagement. The memorials represent not just sorrow, grief, tragedy, and honor, but an engagement, because nobody from the government of India or the state government has touched them. There is an acceptance of them and their role in the battle for the soul and spirit and the history of Nagas and Nagaland. A few years ago, I was walking up the hill in Jubsha. You know Jubsha, near the village of Jubsha, near Kohima, 14 kilometers from Naga. We got to the peak, my friend and I, and I noticed in a small patch of a grove of trees, you know, a patch of green, there was a grave, and a grave which was just there, just across, it was a grave. No headstone, nothing. So I asked what the story was. And it was that this young man had been pursued across the hill from one faction. He was from one faction by the fighters from another faction. The villagers would hear the gunfire. And in the morning when they went up, they saw this body of this young man who had been killed in that. It's about 4,000 feet. Running across that shows you're extremely fit, but one person didn't make it. So they buried him, and when they were looking through his pockets, they found a piece of paper with a phone number, no name, just a phone number. And they called that number, and an elderly person, because nowadays I think you can make out an elderly person's voice, picked up and said, we have found this. He says, I am his father. I am his father, and I would like to come there. So he came there, and they had buried his son. He said a prayer, and then they asked him, is there anything that you would like us to do? Would you like to take the body and bury him in your village? He says, no. You have honored my son, and through that you have honored all of us. Let him rest here in peace and in dignity. And I thank you for what you've done. And that to me is a very powerful telling of the dignity of the story of the Naga people, that in times of grief, in times of trouble, you have understood what many of us don't, which is that it is to honor sacrifice, but also to look at the need for unity. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Sanjoy. I think our two presentations are very much in sequence. Professor Nira presented a very broader perspective the role of civil society, citing the experience from Europe and as well as the development in India. And Professor Hazarika, I could see very practically from the focus northeast. I think this, we are going proper sequence. Now we are 3:23. The program has to wind up by 3:50. So we have how many? 27 minutes to interact. So there are a few questions here. I will just ask them to ask the question instead of me reading out. So I would like to request the question for asking very be precise to the point so that we will save time. Okay. The first question is Professor Ajay Madukar. Is he here to Professor Nira? If you're here, please do ask the question precisely. Yeah, Professor Ajay Madukar.
Actually, to save time, it's, I think, better we ask the question directly, which is, I think, with you. The first question is for Professor Nira Chandok ma'am. And the question is from Professor Ajay Mahulkar. And the question is, does the turning of civil society movements towards the political sphere lead to the process of dissolving the civil society? The question is for you, ma'am.
Madam, you have to unmute. You're mute.
No, I think civil society mobilization and experience in talking to people representing their interests, because civil society organizations have this prime job of representing the interests of people, those spheres of interest which have not been touched by political parties. So in a way, as I tried to show, civil society comes up to fill a gap of the crisis of representation. And a number of leaders in civil society working with people are predominantly interested in and are capable of taking over the reins of power and competing for political power. But they will no longer be civil society. I mean, that is one thing. The rules of civil society are very clearly laid out, that if you are civil society, then you have to monitor the state. And if you're monitoring the state, then you obviously have to be independent of the state. But I think because there is a second question which has a bearing upon this, You see, the moment the concept of civil society was appropriated by international policymakers and donors and the United Nations and all kinds of international organizations, the moment government started taking up civil society as a partner in development, you did have a certain degree of compromises. I think in India, the first time civil society was made a partner of the 5-year plan was probably the 7th plan. I may be mistaken, but I think it's the 7th plan in the 1980s. Now, you can hardly expect civil society organizations to launch a critique of government policies when they are being funded by government. And it has led to a certain amount of, what shall I say, misuse of the concept, because every retiring bureaucrat or his wife set up an NGO. And we saw this when we did our survey of Delhi. I'm talking about 10 years ago. We had taken a list of civil society organizations from 3 sources. They were not there. The officers were not there. So people take money and disappear, don't do anything. So this is a certain amount of compromise. But this happens when states try to co-opt. But still, we have a sizable number of civil society organizations that do critique the government. And I think we have to listen to them. More importantly, in moments of crisis, civil society organization, whether NGOs or social movements or spontaneous uprising, have to join hands. They have to form coalitions. And it is then that, we see the power of civil society. But if they join politics and they come to power, they can no longer be strictly seen as civil society. Then they are power, they are political society, which is marked by the logic of power.
Okay, thank you, madam. Here is another more question to you, madam. Can you please elaborate more on civil society in the context of political theory? Ningrin Unkai. This question to you, madam.
Okay, that's a whole book-length answer. I'll be very brief. The difference is, if you remember Greek political thought in Aristotle, he said man is zoon politikon, he is born into politics. And the Greeks did not know of any distinction between political life and any other form of life. You practiced your life doing politics, and for politics for them meant debate, discussion, reflection, a certain amount of careful consideration being given to predominant issues of the day. Of course, a citizen in Greece was male. He had to be Athenian born. And he had to be propertied. He had to have slaves. That was very clear. So it was a very restricted concept of citizenship. But for Aristotle, individuals are basically political. By political, he meant sociable. There was no distinction between civil and political in that moment. Now, again, I'm not saying civil doesn't mean politics. It means doesn't mean coming into positions of power. By the time you come to the 16th century and Thomas Hobbes, who writes against the background of civil war in England, he tells you the natural condition of man is not politics. The natural condition of man is the state of nature. The state is an artificial creation. It is set up for certain objectives, and that objective is to preserve the primary instinct of man, which is self-preservation. That, he says, is the primary instinct of man. It was very interesting. Hobbes has been seen as an absolutist theorist. But there is an interesting, the sovereign can do anything. He cannot harm your self-preservation, the right to preserve your own life. That means he cannot ask you to go to battle. Your food cannot be denied to you. You can't even be imprisoned without any rhyme or reason. So you see Hobbes carving out a space outside the power of the state, and that space is not civil society. It would be embryonic civil society, a space where individuals could live without having the power of the state being kind of imposed upon them. And this notion of civil society undergoes several modifications, and you have a critical strain which starts from Hegel and not Marx, but Hegel and Gramsci. And you also have an associational aspect which starts from John Locke, John Stuart Mill, and de Tocqueville. And Gramsci is, of course, the prime critic of civil society, but I won't go into that because there's no time. Okay, so that's political theory. It is the beginning of modern political theory. When you start think of politics being not everybody's whole time 24/7 concern, but politics being a specialized activity, and more importantly, you think of the state having limits. The politics of the state having its limit, it cannot interfere with your self-preservation. So you inhabit a domain which is exempt from state power. Of course, the states have become even more powerful than Hobbes's Leviathan, but that is another. That's why we have civil society we expect them to control the state. I mean, I read Sanjoy's late book, Strangers No More. I even have a copy. And he launched a very powerful critique of the Internal Repressive Act. Oh, sorry, what? Yes, it's a very powerful engagement with the state.
Armed Forces Special Powers Act.
Armed Forces Special Powers Act, which is bad in Kashmir, but even worse in the Northeast. Now, that is engagement with power. That's what you expect civil society to do, not join the state. That's my take on it.
Okay, thank you. Madam, there's another more question for you.
Can I just add something?
Okay.
If I may, Professor Chandok, I mean, I was among the people who was tapped by the government to review the Armed Forces Special Powers Act on the Justice Jeevan Reddy Committee, and we did recommend the repeal. It's been 15 years since it was given, and it's not been tabled in Parliament, which is not surprising by any government. But I was not in government. The people who were picked to the committee by the Prime Minister and the Home Minister of the time were all people who had served the state. And I was
you were consulting. You were being consulted. That's fair enough.
Yeah. So.
But did you hold a position of power in the government? You didn't. You were a consultant.
I didn't. But I think the fact that one engaged with government was itself to some people problematic. That one was becoming a member of a committee that government may not heed was also seen as problematic. It's like a can of worms. You know, there's no way out of it. But I felt it was the right thing to do at that time. And I was the only present person literally from civil society who was there. So engagement is important. Even though you may not win, it is important to engage and keep from your side the door of dialogue open. Even if the other side doesn't walk in, you're opening the door. It's for the other side to come in.
No, I agree with you. And I also think that civil society ultimately has to work with political parties and the government, because obviously civil society cannot move legislation and things like that. There have been a lot of questions about the National Advisory Committee set up by Mrs. Sonia Gandhi, and a lot of criticism about it even now of the dual centers of power that were set up. And there could have been other ways. But, you know, they did good work. I mean, you have to understand that they were not holding positions of profit in the way that bureaucrats are or politicians are. So that I think civil society has to work with political parties and with the state. How are you going to get your initiatives transformed into policy? So I don't buy that autonomy. There is no such thing. A civil society reflects its surrounding spheres of life, whether it's the state or the market, or even the household, because you're busy fighting patriarchy in civil society and other groups are busy upholding patriarchy, which is a feature of the household. So yeah, I accept your argument.
No, and not only that, it's just we are part of this larger process, because we have to keep this engagement going, whether it's with one government or one party or another. It's just no way out of it, right?
Just one more question is here, madam. Can I just read out for you? Should we consider bureaucratization of civil society that comes with the NGOization as a slow death of civil society, a form of co-option into official channels of doing politics that kills the emancipatory potential of civil society? That's his address to Professor Neera, but we can just respond here. Yeah.
You know, I personally think that these categories of co-option or confrontation are not exclusive. There is a whole way in which you relate to the government. Of course, there has been a certain amount of co-option by international agencies and there were questions asked. I remember one East European once saying, we asked for civil society, we got NGOs, because then you wonder whether it has become a profession, alternative profession. And if they're not in touch with the ordinary popular opinion, if they're not mobilizing people, if they're not making them aware of their rights or playing the role of a transformation. I also wonder whether, and I asked this of somebody who's been running an NGO in Udaipur for a long time, and how long are you guys going to continue organizing the lives of others? Why don't you make them self-sufficient? And the answer was, what can I do when a tribal beats up his wife? I mean, come on, you should carry out all kinds of, this is self-perpetuating, isn't it? I mean, the ultimate objective of civil society intervention is to make people to allow them to speak for themselves, instead of always, because whether we like it or not. You see, and I want to give there's an anecdote which might well be true of the Narmada Bachao Andolan. In 1984, when the government started removing the Adivasis from their forests, and the issue of compensation for land lost, which was lost to the dam, was raised by two civil society movements. One was the Rajpipla Society, the other was the Ardhvahini, which incidentally didn't form a part of the Narmada Bachao Andolan. They were blacklisted quite badly. And they said you have to give even Adivasis who do not hold formal title to land compensation. So there's a story about a bureaucrat who went to the Adivasis area, and he said, which is your land? And that guy said, this is my land. And he says, where is your patta? I have no patta, because Adivasis do not hold a land by title. They have different ways of ownership. So he said, how do you know it's your land? He said, the bones of my forefathers are buried here on the boundaries. Now, this is a perfectly valid way of staking out your claim to land, which has happened in very many societies across the world. The bones of my forefathers are buried in the boundaries of my land is a valid way of establishing ownership of land. But the bureaucrat says, no compensation, and he walks away. And it was only when these two organizations took up the issue of compensation, Meda Patkar had joined by then late 80s, of compensation even for Adivasis who did not hold formal title to land, that they started being given land in lieu of land. I don't think they got very interesting land, but whatever. Now, immediately what strikes you is the difference in language between the Adivasi saying, this is my land because the bones of my forefathers are buried here, and the intermediary organizations who know the language of the public sphere. You know, that your land, your possession, you're a landowner if you have the right papers. How long are the Adivasis going to be dependent upon educated middle-class activists to do their work for them? I mean, why shouldn't the middle-class activists who are educated, who know the language of the public sphere, also strive to make indigenous communities somewhat speak for themselves? I mean, that's what we'd like to see. But then this is a very complex issue, because then ultimately you have to say, if there are groups working for the benefit of people who do not know the language of the public sphere, we have to hail it. But sometimes whenever we've raised these issues in meetings with civil society activists, immediately you get attacked as armchair academics. And then I keep repeating, you know, some way even your politics has to be set up for examination. Politics is a process of constant self-critique. So don't be too happy, don't be too proud that you are the people. You're not the people, you're representing the people. Of course, they're doing it in different ways. But there's a very uneasy debate which is happening about the whole notion of who are they accountable to, who are they representative of. But I'll set it aside for the moment, because now that civil society is in great trouble in our present condition, and it's being completely demolished. And what is interesting is, and this has been pointed out by many observers, that the organizations under attack by the present government are advocacy organizations, they're human rights organizations. I don't know if the Commonwealth Human Rights Initiative has been subjected to it, but certainly Amnesty in Bangalore has been subjected to a lot of harassment, other civil liberty movements. What is not being targeted are organizations that subcontract for the government in the aspect of service delivery. I mean, they are subcontracting for the government. In a way, it's a privatization of the government because you're subcontracting issues. But generally, now that civil society is under attack, we don't have the luxury of even raising issues about about the whole sphere. And you have to say, thank God we have somebody who speaks up for the people. But I don't know how long this is going to last, because I think we are in trouble because our opposition parties are in a mess. I mean, not there. And our civil society organizations, the leaders are behind bars now. Who is going to speak up for tomorrow? You and I get arrested. Who is going to speak for us? I don't understand. Judiciary, we can no longer rely upon. I mean, if the Supreme Court judge, the CGI can say that this issue of Article 32 should be re-examined, I mean, it's frightening, because Article 32 is what makes the fundamental rights valid for all of us. So we are living in difficult times, and I'm personally happy with whatever civil society exists. We are not raising these issues we were raising 15 years ago. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, madam. Time is running short, but there's still one question that to Professor Sanjoy from Mingwei John. Can you just read out? I'll read out. Professor Hazarika, in your note and observation on what ails Nagaland is also the lack of integrity. Would you appreciate your deeper elaborations and clearer interpretations on this? This is Professor Sanjoy, from Mingwei John, I think. So I can take.
Thank you.
As far as possible.
I'll be very brief.
Yeah.
That statement was really part of a reflection of the broader issues impacting the Northeast. I talked about the lack of governance, lack of infrastructure, a lack of communications, and a lack of trust. This was the finding of the Shukla Commission way back in '97. I've just added the issue of a lack of integrity, and that you can take to mean in any way. I did define it as financial accountability, administrative accountability, even accountability of non-state actors to the people. So all these things actually call for, and I would urge this, that you people who feel strongly about these issues as far as the government is concerned, use what's called the RTI. I don't think enough of it is used in the Northeast. Right to information request to get information of how much money was spent on a project, who was given that contract, and how much work has been done in the time that has been allotted. Just simple ways we can become active citizens. You know, this is a time when you have to be active citizens. You don't have to be an activist. You just have to be a citizen who is interested enough to follow the laws of the land and use them for the benefit of the community in which you live.
Sure.
Okay, thank you, Professor. We have discussed much about the different perspectives.
I think he's got
civil society. Yeah. Am I audible to you?
Yes, audible.
Yeah, just a few words. I think civil society movement Nagaland is a bit worrying. Personally, to me, it seems to have, in one sense, lost the capability to influence the government and society. And society is being fragmented in one sense. Of course, there are several movements out there, but I fail to see in my personal way the impact, very concrete impact on society, where we really need a civil society to put certain pressure on the government, especially the corruptions that are taking place. Ordinary citizens become the victim of that. I think it should be the role of civil society to come out very clearly and put certain pressure to stop it. At the same time, apart from the government, there are many other organization groups out there who really, I mean, putting a lot of difficulties to the society, ordinary people. But our civil society try to come out, but not to the extent that we expected. I think as Nagas, scholars can just give some thought on this and how can we revive our society and make it vital and dynamically work it a bit so that some good sense will prevail in society. With this reward, I want to say thank you to professors who have presented your paper in such a way that's really illuminating to all of us. I believe all the participants are being benefited. With this word, now I will hand over the time to a president to say a word of thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Nira Chandok, ma'am, for sharing such a profound, perspective on civil society and also explaining how it plays a vital role in the nation building. Thank you very much, ma'am. You have been very cooperative to many of our NSA initiatives, and we look forward to having you even in the days to come. And we also would like to thank Professor Sanjay Hazarika, who in fact has been a great help to NSA. He has also participated in a few of our activities. And even though I have introduced him at the beginning, let me just briefly introduce him for maybe, but anyway, he doesn't need actually introduction. Anyway, Professor Sanjay Hazarika is a director of CHRI, and he is a human rights activist recognized across the globe for for designing and developing innovative strategies for inclusive health and governance. And he is also a scholar, author, journalist, and a filmmaker, very versatile personality. Thank you very much, Professor Sanjay Hazarika, for joining us in spite of your tight schedule. And thank you very much for also for sharing your perspectives on the session. And would like to give thanks to Professor Yoringam, the chairperson. Thank you very much for effectively sharing the session. And there are many other questions who would like to ask, but very sorry because of the time limit, we are unable to give you the opportunity. And now we will go to the next session. We have a very interesting technical session that is coming up. So I would like to invite all of you to join us in the next session. And we have the first technical session on identity and nationalism, and then followed by environment and climate change. We are going to have Professor Murari coming all the way from Michigan State University, chairing the session on environment and climate change. And of course, the next session on identity and nationalism, we have we have Mr. Gam Shimri, all the way from Thailand to chair the session. I request all of you to join us. You may use the same link, and it is also, of course, connected on Facebook Live. So please stay back and you can continue for the next session. We also would like to thank technical support team, EDU trainers for the support that you have been giving to NSA. Thank you very much. So with this, we come to the end of a very interesting plenary session. So we invite all of you to the next session. Thank you once again.
Thank you very much. Right.